Hi everyone. This video talks about what I call relative position scales. By relative position scales, I'm talking about scales that I'm going to be referring to or expressing in relative position terms. In other words, I'm not going to be saying GAB, I'm going to be saying 1, 2, 3. For example, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And 8 could be 1 also, starting on the new octave. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now, why do I want to do that? Well, the reason I want to do that, one reason I want to do that, is so that we can talk about that scale in any key you want. This one happens to start in the key of G. So I would be saying in the key of G, 1 being G, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So that I could transfer that into any key you want, and I just need to name the starting key. But in particular with this, also related to this topic, or you might say this topic or this video covers another topic, and that is 7 scales, 7 major scales, or 7 important scales. There are actually many scales, but these are 7 important scales in 7 relative positions. So in other words, and also they are the same scale. So the major diatonic scale, for example, this is, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. If you start in the next position, which is 2, or in this case A, that is a completely different scale because it's got, for example, minor, but it's part of the same major diatonic scale in that it's playing the exact same notes, only starting in the second position. Of course, it goes above, now that it's starting in the second position, it goes above into the next octave. So it's starting here. So it's starting in the next position, and it's actually a minor scale, and it's got different notes in it, and so on, starting in the third position. And the fourth position. Starting in the fifth position. Starting in the sixth position. Seventh position. Sounds kind of weird in this one. And then finally in the octave, which sounds exactly like the original starting position in G, because it's the octave and it's playing the exact same notes an octave higher. So why am I talking about this? Well, even though all those scales are playing the exact same notes as the major diatonic scale and notes that are in the major diatonic scale on the next octave, they are completely different scales that you can also play in the key of G. And it's nice to know what those differences are in those notes. In the key of G, you can play that same scale. So let me just give you an example. The second scale we played. Well, that's the first scale, but the second scale is. So it would be desirable to know what the differences are when you play it in the key of G. So get a feel for this. I'll noodle around on it so you can kind of center your mind in this second scale. Now take this back to the G scale. So what's the difference between that and... There is a substantial difference in that the 7th note and the 3rd note are flatted. What do I mean by that? Well, it means that I brought the 7th note down a half a step, and I brought the 3rd note down a half a step as compared to the original major diatonic scale. So instead of playing, for example, that 3rd goes, so it goes, and then the 7th note is flatted. So 1, 2, flatted 3rd, 4th, flatted 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, flatted 7th, octave 8. So we now know the difference in G between the 1st scale and the 2nd scale. Now, just to make things a little more complicated, because we want to cover all of these scales, but there are names out there, and I don't particularly like the naming convention, but they actually have a name for both of those scales. I am giving them to you not as a duty to memorize, but as kind of a reference point, because in the world of music, they actually have names for those scales. They actually call them modes. You know, you could call it different modes of the same scale, because they just have a different starting point that these modes will occur. You can call them modes, you can call them scales, but this 1st scale is called, it's called the Ionian Mode, or the Ionian Scale. It's also called the major diatonic scale. It's a very, notice it's got a very happy sound. And it's used a lot in folk music, Irish music especially. It's used in a lot of pop music. Anyway, the second one is called the Dorian Mode. Or we're going to play it in G. And as I said before, it's got a flatted 7th and a flatted 3rd. It occurs naturally when you play it in A, when you're going up the scale, when you're going up the main scale, because this scale, you could call it a universal scale. Because you simply need to start at the 2nd note to get or to result in the 2nd scale. So there, I guess you could call it scales occurring along the way up the main scale. And so that second one is the Dorian mode. The third one that occurred naturally when playing the major diatonic or Ionian scale. And you may have guessed it by now, that's used a lot in like flamenco music. And so that mode, you can call it the Phrygian mode. And when we play it in G, it looks like this. So it's got a flatted seventh, a flatted sixth, a flatted third, or a fourth, a flatted third, and a flatted second. And it can be confusing going back and forth to key of G, but I'm trying to show basically what where the scale occurs on the major diatonic scale going up. In other words, here I start at the first note, I go to the next note, and I play a scale. I go to the next note and play a scale that is just basically the major diatonic scale, only starting at position 3, 4, etc. So I play a scale naturally occurring there, and then I transpose it back down to G to show you the difference in sharps and flats. And only in one case will I show you a sharp. The other ones, all of them are just flatting certain notes. Okay, and so these are main scales that occur in music. There's major diatonic, and where was I? I was starting, this time I'll start in the fourth position. Okay, the scale that occurs here is a little bit of strange scale. All it is the same as a major diatonic scale, only it's got a flatted fifth. 2, 3. Or you could say that fourth is a sharped fourth because you are playing the fifth. Sharped fourth or flatted fifth, as you like. Fifth, so if you only want to mention 5 once, 2, 3, 4, it's a sharped fourth because it's the fourth note. We're counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's a sharped fourth because instead of it's so interestingly enough it's an interesting scale that sounds rather foreign, but it does sound at least within the realm of normalness, at least for my ears. So let's transpose it down to G. Sharped fourth, fifth. So that's the only difference between that and the regular major diatonic Ionian mode. And this one's called the Lydian mode. So it's kind of not on my list of normal scales to play. But if you're in that mode and you understand what it is, it's easier, and you know you are aware of what you're doing, it's kind of easier for you to come up with notes when you're using it and understand how it's relating to the main tune, or how it is the main tune, and how to play other notes that would relate to it. So, Lydian mode I covered there, and I converted it to G. Now let's go to the next one. On the fifth here, we have another one that only has one difference. So, all it has, and the positions of this will be a lot like, well, exactly like G, only with a different starting string, because it's starting on an open string in D. Notes from the next string, and this one has a funny name. It's called the Mixolydian Mode. Mixolydian Mode. The only difference, if you transfer it down to G, it's just got a flatted fifth. So instead of going here, you just go here. So, Mixolydian, M-I-X-Y something, Mixolydian. And so, weird name, but it's understood in the world of music. I wouldn't expect or desire for you to so much memorize it as to understand that there is a scale, that the only difference from the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do scale is that it's got a flatted fifth. Or flatted seventh, rather. And that's 7. Is the number of the note that we're flatting. The other notes we're playing as normal. And it occurs in the 5th position when we're playing that scale, and we're playing 2 octaves of the major diatonic scale. And so, if we want to say in the same scale as we're going up, the scale in the 5th position is, you might call it the Mixolydian Scale. Here's another scale starting in 6. It's an interesting scale. It's kind of mournful. It's kind of a mournful scale. And when you play it in G, it looks like this. It's got a flatted 7th, a flatted 6th, and a flatted 3rd. In other words, instead of playing, you play that. So compare, when I say flatted, I'm saying compared to that major diatonic scale. This scale, which happens to be called the Aeolian Mode, or the Aeolian Scale, it's got a flatted 7th, so it's got that one flatted. It's flatting the 6th. It's flatting the 3rd. used a lot in Eastern European music. I don't know if you ever heard a lot of Eastern European music, but it tends to have what the Western ear would call, people from more like Western Europe and Britain and Americans would call a sad sound. For all I know, over there when they play it, maybe depending on the words, to them it's a very happy song. I don't know. Maybe it just depends on what they're talking about. If the words of the song are very happy, maybe. I don't know, but a lot of their music sounds like that, and it just sounds like, wow, the general impression you might get if you're not really having any other information to go on except the sound, how it occurs in your mind, you might come up with a thought of, oh, what sad people, oh, what a sad life they may have. Oh, things are so sad and tragic over there, because you're just listening, la 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 la. You might thinking, oh, it must be a sad song, and for all I know, they're talking about how wonderful it is that they got married. I don't know. I confess that I don't have universal knowledge of all cultures here. Speaking of which, I'll play this last scale, and I have a little point of interest about other cultures when it comes to these notes. It may be a little more universal than I thought it was at first. So anyway, this last scale, we're going along here. So we're going to play this other scale that occurs naturally when we're playing the major diatonic scale, and we start here, 7th note. That, to me, is a very kind of, you might say, a useless scale to me. I don't really find myself getting into it. I think if you played in it long enough, you would start to maybe understand its vibe better or comprehend it musically better. So its first note is the only thing left in the first octave of that major diatonic / Ionian scale I showed you. So it's only got one note, then it proceeds to the next octave and plays note 1 through 7 of that. But it's starting here, so the scale is very different. It's so different, I have a hard time converting it to G and knowing what's going on. The other ones are pretty easy. I'll talk about it from here right now and say one comment I'll make on it. Number one, it's called the Locrian, L-O-C-R-I-A-N, the Locrian Mode or Locrian Scale. What I see that scale being the most useful for is maybe when you're transitioning in a musical piece that's maybe walking down from G to E, for example. It's useful for that. Honestly, it's kind of an out of tune sounding thing. I will try to convert it. Oh, I just remembered. It's got a flatted 7th, a flatted 6th, a flatted 5th, a flatted 3rd, and a flatted 2nd. So let's try that. It's like the Phrygian scale, only one more flat. So it's. scales. So anyway, I can't even play it hardly at all. But that's called the Locrian mode. And so hopefully you get the idea of these modes and scales. I didn't talk about where all these are used in music. I'd say the Dorian mode, which is the second one. You can use that a lot in rock. You'll hear that in some of the rock and roll jams. Same with Mixolydian Mode. It's kind of in rock. And so they all have different kind of emotions that they evoke, or buzzwords that seem to come in your mind about them. Like say the Dorian Mode sounds kind of a little sad and a little moody, but you know, not too moody. The Mixolydian Mode sounds kind of like you know, it's only one note different than the major diatonic or Ionian Mode, but which is this one here starting in D or converted in G. And that's used a lot in Irish music, as I had said before, but it's also a lot in rock too. So just summing up, what I'll say is that I would say the scales that are the most common in my use are that first one, the diatonic scale, major diatonic scale. Ionian mode, as some people call it, I-O-N-I-A-N. You know, the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do scale. I find myself using Dorian mode quite a bit. It's very common. Or converted to G. I find myself using the Aeolian mode, which is like the Dorian mode, only a little more moody, because it's got one more thing flatted. So, or converted to G. You can hear it used a lot in folk music and blues, maybe, yeah, blues, and just it's a more moody one, and I find myself using it very often. So Dorian, Ionian, this Aeolian, those are three very commonly used scales in a lot of music. You add that one that's the Persian one that I showed you, that extends into a lot of heavy metal and flamenco as well. They use it in different ways, but they're primarily, you know, that flatted second starts coming in, and in addition to the other flatted notes, and it kind of makes even more moodier tones, kind of grim. And so the Lydian I find very not common to use, and the Locrian not common to use. So basically flatted, you know, so there are scales that are very common. Mixolydian is part of the picture going up the scale, and so is Locrian. At least to know what it is great. And a little cultural side note that I said I was going to talk about is people from India, they have their own music theory. And for example, they have that same scale. And ironically, they have names for it, just like we have do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. They have, I think it's sal is their first note. Just like ours, the second note is called re, and you know they have different notes there. I don't know, I don't have them all memorized, but it's something like sal, re, you know, I forgot the notes going up, but they're different names. Ironically, the seventh note, like we call it T, they call it, I believe, ni, and then they return back to sal. So they have those 7 notes. And so those 7 notes, just so you know, there are actually 12 notes in the scale. It's called the chromatic scale. In other words, when you include all those sharps and flats and play them all in one scale, instead of like what we were doing is we were playing notes, 7 notes in a scale, and then the next note we played, or the next scale we played, was basically it would have flatted notes and flatted differently for different scales. If you're playing all of the flats or sharps, whatever you want to call them, all the semitones to these scales, you get the chromatic scale, which includes all the notes. For example, so there's 12 notes in there. So we're simply changing the flats, or in that one case we were changing the fourth to a sharped fourth, we could call it. But in all cases, we were, you know, when you want to include all of those, it's called the chromatic scale, because it includes all notes of the scale. It's basically a 12-note scale. And so, so you might say that the 7 notes of the scale, you know, are kind of, you might say, pleasing to the ear. In other words, those frequencies, humans have kind of find those more adaptable to their minds or something. And this chromatic scale doesn't sound that musical. It sounds more like, so what I would encourage you to do is play all these scales both in the key of G, or just some basic key, the key of D, and then also play them as they occur along the path up the diatonic scale. Because that you could say that diatonic scale, that major diatonic scale, that Ionian mode, you could call it, I don't know, for all I know you could start at any point of them. But if you start in that Ionian mode, you will find those scales occurring naturally if you change the starting point. So like you're playing in the key of G, you start in B, you're automatically, if you're playing in the major diatonic scale starting there, you're automatically playing in a different scale if you end the octave, you know, at, you know, if your last note is in the octave of that starting note that you started on. So summing up, like for example, use that as an exercise, and you can also learn that in all the, you know, starting in all of the different keys. You can say, well, my major diatonic is going to start in A. and so to do this exercise. But you might wonder, why am I getting into this? Why am I talking about this? I believe it's important to have different knowledge, different kind of awarenesses of your playing on the violin or on any instrument. You might say it's your mental part of your playing. Now, interestingly enough, I went for years never even thinking about this. I just thought, well, here's a minor scale, I would call it, and it's got a flatted 6. I wouldn't even go that far. I would just say, you know, down here I play this note instead of that note, and it's just the way I did it, you know. And so there were probably, you might say, 4 scales or maybe 5 scales that I played. I completely ignored the other 2 scales, didn't even think of them. And you know, honestly, you can go your whole life without even thinking about any of this. In fact, the music you play, especially if it's folk music, might be just 2 of these scales, and you might not even be thinking about it. And so it's just occurring at a, you might say, a semi-conscious level, not necessarily a subconscious level, but at a level that you're not really looking at all of the scales at all, because the type of music you play, the other scales are maybe irrelevant to it, and they're kind of weird. But if you're composing music or wanting to understand better what's going on with the scales you're playing and kind of see how they relate to other scales, it can be beneficial to know this. I would say that sometimes the more you get into music theory, as they call it, which I call it musical mechanics, because it's maybe theory, they mean theory in a different sense than I mean the word theory. Like, theory to me is like something you haven't proven yet. Well, this is all, these are facts. So whether you want to call it musical facts or the mechanics of music, it's still a kind of a mental thing. It's not emotional. It's kind of analyzing what's going on with the notes. I think that people that do it too much can kind of diminish the emotionality of their music. You know, if you listen to them talk and they start playing, you know, people that are getting into this and explaining it, they don't sound very emotional at all. And so you might lose touch with the emotionality of music if you overly emphasize this type of thing. It can become almost clinical sounding. Some jazz honestly sounds that way to me. It sounds kind of clinical. And so, but then sometimes you have an actual emotional yearning to talk about those clinical aspects of music because you believe they're important. You want to tell the world. So as an example, this video, I didn't even test it to set up, you know, whether you can even see my violin correctly or not. I hope you can. I'll have to do this video over again, but I don't even know if you can see it. Why? Because I was so passionate emotionally about talking about a very, maybe you might say, non-emotional aspect of music, because I'm excited about it, having kind of learned about it as I was trying to come up with how I was going to explain this video, and watching a lot of other videos, filling in knowledge gaps of mine so that I could explain this better. So I hope you were able to get into it. So that's the key of G. Thank you for watching. Hit the subscribe button if you want to see more things like this, or be notified of more things like this, or maybe not like this. And by all means, hit the like button if you did not dislike this.